I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this symposium. Dr. Brea Perry is Professor of Sociology and most recently the Associate Vice Provost for Research at Indiana University. She's also affiliated faculty of the Indiana University Network Science Institute. Her research investigates the interrelated roles of social networks, biomarkers, social psychology, and social inequality in health and illness, with a particular focus on mental illness and substance use disorders. And much of her work employs egocentric social network analysis, including multi-level and longitudinal modeling. In 2019, Dr. Perry was named an Emerging Leader in Health and Medicine Scholar by the National Academy of Medicine. The honor is part of the Academy's Emerging Leaders in Health and Medicine program, which provides a platform for exceptional leaders to collaborate with the National Academy of Medicine to advance science to improve health. In addition to her many awards, Dr. Perry's research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and the McManus Foundation. She's published over 35 articles and book chapters since 2006, and her work appears in top journals across disciplines, including sociology, psychology, medicine, and genetics. Dr. Perry recently also authored a book on ego network methodology with Bernice Pescosolido and Steve Borgatti, which I highly, highly recommend. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Brea Perry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I am really happy that this symposium began with Claire Bedard's wonderful talk. There are a lot of overlaps in theme with what I'm going to talk about today, so that it provides sort of really good bookends to this excellent symposium that Stephanie and Leora and Claude put together. I am going to try to share my screen now. Let's see. I have varying success with technology, so we'll see how this goes. Okay, is that working? Everybody can see what I'm doing here? Okay, let me move that out of the way. All right. A lot of the presentations in this symposium have focused on sort of critical methodological considerations when conducting dynamic personal network analysis, and that's been really wonderful and informative. I'm going to try to take a little bit more theoretical perspective on network change and then discuss some of the implications for methods, but also for future research. So a major goal of this presentation is to synthesize a whole lot of research to try to establish some basic organizing principles that structure and drive personal network dynamics. It was really interesting that yesterday in his discussion, Ben Cornwell mentioned that personal networks are a system, because that is what my talk is about. Sometimes I feel like Ben and I might be psychically connected because I read his work and it's like we think about things very similarly. So I will be really interested to hear his and everyone else's feedback. This, what I'm presenting today is a chapter in a handbook that I'm currently editing with Mario Small, so this will be coming out in print pretty soon. So yeah, still time for incorporating feedback if anyone has any. Okay, so, all right. So the centerpiece of this talk, it begins with a key paradox of personal networks. And so I won't belabor this because we've sort of talked about it over and over. There have been a lot of presentations about this, but we tend to see remarkable structural stability, and that is belied by significant underlying dynamics at the level of sort of interactions and dyads and individuals. And so a lot of people measure this with membership turnover or tie churn. This picture is from something that Bernice and I published, I don't know, in 20-something long ago. And so this is a paradox, right? Because we have this dichotomy between stability and change, right? Stability and change. So the roadmap for this keynote, I'd like to let you know where we're going, is to leverage the tenets of complex systems theories to provide some insight into this paradox. So my first goal is going to be to convince you that this is a good idea, and that's probably the hardest part of the talk. Then I'm going to present 5 organizing principles of complex adaptive systems theory. There are more, but I don't want to be here boring you all day. I'm sure many of you want to be eating lunch right now. Third, I'm going to apply these principles to personal network stability and change. And then fourth, I'm going to discuss some of the implications for methods and future research. Okay, so what are complex adaptive systems? They are simply a structure of interdependent subsystems with these unique but complementary functions that give rise somewhat organically to collective behavior. And the reason that I initially thought about pairing complex adaptive systems theory and personal network dynamics is because they have this sort of similar focus on the interest between, as Miller and Page say, stasis and utter chaos, right? So the world tends not to be completely frozen or random, but rather it exists in between these two states. And that just seems like a really good fit for personal network dynamics. So complex systems have been widely applied in a range of scientific disciplines to explain many, many phenomena, including things like global climate, cellular functioning, brain networks, information grids, anything where you have these constitutive components that are dynamic and difficult to model in isolation from one another. So this picture happens to be a climate system from my 9th grade daughter's online science course from the spring. Helping her with this distant learning, I'm sure many of you can relate, made me really appreciate that I get to study people and not weather. So why complex adaptive systems? CAS is really ideal for explaining emergence, right? Emergent or adaptive properties of not just social systems, but lots of different kinds of systems. So we tend to see these patterns and structures that repeat over and over in network research, right? So things like transitivity and homophily, hierarchy and reciprocity. So while not ubiquitous, right, you can pick out lots of individual studies where you don't see these patterns, they do tend to be observed repeatedly in study after study of egocentric and sociocentric networks. And so we find that these kind of features tend to sort of transcend time, space, and culture. So despite a lack of centralized control, people in interactions often do organize themselves in predictable or similar ways across time and thus across different kinds of studies. Another thing I like about CAS is that this theory provides a nice solution to the sort of Hobbesian problem of order. So that is that macro level structural stability emerges kind of bottom up out of dynamic and sometimes unpredictable micro interactions, dyads, and small groups, right? And that's exactly what CAS is about. So it sort of allows us to find a solution to that problem. And then fourth, I really like CAS because it can also help us understand and predict dysfunction. And because I'm fundamentally interested in individuals and individual health, this is something that's very important to me. So CAS could potentially help us to identify network structures that are not adaptive or that are inherently unstable and thus threaten the social or psychological well-being of the egos that are embedded in those networks. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over the principles of CAS and then talk about them in a little bit more detail when I apply them to personal social networks. So first, they perform a unified function. So the sort of key here is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So that might be familiar to you if you're, Barry Wellman said this, that network ties are more than the sum of their parts. So the subsystems together perform some kind of collective function that is not reducible to any of the functions of one subcomponent, right? And second, complex systems adapt to dynamic and uncertain environments. And the idea, sorry about that, is that this property increases the resiliency and fitness of the organism. Sorry, so it allows people to sort of adjust to external threats and take advantage of opportunities in the environment. Third, it is comprised of interconnected complementary subsystems. So there are these subsystems that interact with one another, and this creates over time a set of sort of stable relationships between those parts that contributes to the structural stability of the whole. But each subsystem tends to have its own function. or role in the larger system. And then fourth, they exhibit a hierarchical organization. So one component's actions or products may be nested in another's. And then fifth, one of the major properties is that similar to personal networks, there's a stable structure and then underlying sort of bursty dynamics, right, that allows complex systems to be fluid and responsive. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is apply these to personal social networks. This is a little bit uncomfortable for me because I typically get to hide behind my data. But today I'm just like going all out on theory, and I'm largely using other people's examples and data, including many of the people who are in the audience right now, to illustrate the principles that I'm presenting today. So principle one, personal social networks serve a critical unified function. So the function of personal social networks is to meet the social and biological needs of individuals, right? So I'm a biosociologist, that's one of my other hats, so I really like biology. I like integrating it with sociology, I think that's super interesting. So I read a lot of stuff in evolutionary theory, cognitive neuroscience, that sort of stuff. And we as a social species have really strong biological and psychological motivation to form and maintain bonds with members of a social group. And these motivations are thought to have emerged in response to selective pressures, which sort of resulted somewhat organically in large, complex, and cooperative communities that were beneficial to early humans, you know, running around in little caves, which makes me sound not like a biosociologist at all, whatever. So in essence, personal social networks are kind of the microstructures that integrate individuals into larger macro structures. And then these provide things like social capital and social psychological benefits that humans need to survive and thrive. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sort of three elements of each of these principles, and you're going to get like a little bit of a window into how incredibly type A I am, because you know, every sort of principle is going to sort of unfold in exactly the same way, so I'm sorry for that. So humans are highly motivated to connect. So I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, the first sociologist to talk about this. Charles Kadushin theorized about the fundamental motivations for forming personal relationships and sort of the implications of these for network structures. So he argued both in a 2002 piece and in his 2012 book that there are two sort of basic human drives that are fulfilled by personal networks. So one is the need for safety, which is related to sort of feelings of trust and interdependence and support. So essentially like bonding social capital. And the other is the need for effectiveness, which gives people a sense of mastery, allows people to compete for resources in ways that might improve fitness. And that sort of loosely maps onto bridging social capital. And so Kadushin suggested that these drives then correspond sort of loosely to cohesion and brokerage, or closure and brokerage respectively. And that these two motivations are always operating simultaneously, which explains why a lot of network structures, including like the core periphery structure, exist and is pervasive because it facilitates both safety and effectiveness simultaneously. There are a ton of studies that I could highlight which underscore this idea that we're hardwired for interaction. I'll just talk about sort of one of the things that I've more recently become interested in, and that's mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are neurons that fire when an animal acts, and then also when the animal observes the same action in another peer animal, right? And so the neurons sort of mirror the behavior or emotions of the other organism, as though that observer were themselves acting or experiencing whatever the event is. So if you look at this graphic here, it shows, this is just a bilateral fMRI, and so it shows sort of which parts of the brain light up, and you can see that there's similar functional MRI activity when you're performing a particular action, and that's the top set of brains. Witnessing someone else performing it, that's the middle set, and then the bottom set is just hearing someone talk about that same event. And these processes occur really automatically, and they allow us to essentially understand other people's actions, their expressions, their intentions. This, mirror neurons are thought to be heavily involved in things like empathy and having vicarious experiences. And what's really interesting is that this neural activity is stronger, so the brain lights up more for people that we know better and care more about, right, compared to like a stranger. I love this kind of stuff. It's kind of ridiculous. And then also, obviously, we know, as many of you have talked about today, that social integration is associated with fitness, right? It's absolutely necessary for humans to survive and thrive. So this is from that 2010 meta-analysis, which I'm sure all of us use all the time and are familiar with, which suggests that social integration has a larger effect on life expectancy than a lot of the individual level behaviors that we often hear about, which makes me personally very happy, and sort of goes against the idea that, you know, like sex, drugs, and rock and roll at the individual level are what's really driving mortality or life expectancy. Okay, the second principle is that personal networks adapt to dynamic and uncertain environments. And we've heard a lot about this today as well, right? So they're highly adaptive. They tend to evolve pretty organically in response to both internal and external events or conditions, particularly those that create things like uncertainty or that tax an individual's capacity for coping by themselves with whatever is going on. And the key here really is adaptivity, right? So features of personal networks contribute to the ability of individuals and even social groups and communities to respond to external threats. So the first sort of example I want to bring up is action sets, which are from anthropology. And anthropologists have sort of long argued that humans adapt to challenges by forming what they call dynamic action sets. I didn't actually hear about action sets until recently because, you know, silos. But it's really interesting and very much in line with tie activation processes that we talk about a lot. So an action set is just an interacting group of alters who form a temporary alliance or develop relationships for a specific and limited purpose. And the idea is that they're completing a task or a project that no single individual could complete on their own. So depicted here is data from Adrian Meyer's study of the election of a congressional candidate in India from 1966. And this is a graphic of an action set that he documented. And what's sort of interesting about this is that inclusion in the action set is defined by political alliance, right? So that's what this is. It's an action set to get someone elected. But the nature of the actual ties between actors is very heterogeneous, right? So there's kinship, there's being in the same caste, living in the same state. And so this very much mirrors sort of what we see with personal networks, where you have these ties that are present all the time, but they may sort of be on or off. And interestingly, these anthropologists find that if an action set is mobilized repeatedly, it can become a more stable cluster. So, like, for example, you know, in grad school, if you had a temporary study group, eventually those people might become your friends. Or like Community, great show. My daughters are super into that show right now. Okay. And then the second thing I want to talk about is tie activation, which we've talked about a lot again here. And this is sort of the idea that ties reflect these relational states that are almost always on, at least until a tie is truly dissolved. And they might include things like kinship or friendship or being a coworker. But these ties are also characterized by differing forms and levels of interaction at any given time. So they may be more or less active, which is a major challenge for longitudinal studies of networks, as we know. And the extended periphery of personal social networks typically contains members that are less salient, that are less frequently called upon, and as a result, they tend to be or could be inactive at any given time, at any given sort of snapshot of the network. And so Bernice and I have done some work, and others, suggesting that who is activated depends on lots of different factors. It can depend on characteristics of the alters that happen to be available in the network, of ego and ego circumstances, and characteristics of the structure or composition of the network as a whole. And then Mario Small's work, if you're not familiar with it, also suggests that who is activated may even depend on who just happens to be around at a time when someone needs help, right? So there can even be a degree of sort of randomness or chance to these processes. And then finally, a really important part of this idea of adaptability is that these processes should confer resiliency, right? Or they should be positive for the person or the organism. And so along these lines, a lot of the work on tie activation examines how egos and networks respond during periods of crisis or uncertainty. So a lot of the examples are things like natural disasters, widowhood, severe illness, job loss, and so on. And this research tends to suggest that action sets or tie activation, or however you want to talk about this, these processes contribute to individuals' resiliency and fitness through at least three mechanisms. So one is that these alters that are peripheral or sort of infrequently activated may have less redundancy with core supporters. So they provide bridging capital, right? They provide access to unique kinds of resources that may not be available in the core. Second, these action sets and activated ties are fluid. So they can be quickly mobilized or temporarily reconfigured without a lot of long-term loss of function, right? So it's sort of like easy come, easy go. And we see this a lot. One of my former grad students and I, Will McConnell, did a paper on network turnover and changing needs and resources as people move through the illness career. And then selective activation and deactivation can also help alters to avoid egos to avoid overburdening alters, right? So they can sort of get different things that they need from their network without overburdening any one person. However, one thing that's really interesting is that research on Hurricane Katrina, for example, suggests that social class and race and your neighborhood structure, all of these things influence the extent to which networks can be leveraged for adaptation. So we always have to remember that these personal networks, although I would argue that they're sort of systems in themselves, they're also nested in a broader social structure that constrains to some extent the agency that individuals can exert within their personal networks. Principle 3, personal networks are comprised of interconnected subgroups that have distinct but complementary functions. So we find that networks tend to be compartmentalized but complementary. So they contain these smaller, partially overlapping clusters that may provide specialized opportunities for interaction and exchange. So these subsystems are distinct, they overlap, they interact with one another, which can create some dependency or cooperation sort of between the clusters in a network. And then although the complex system as a whole exhibits unity of purpose, each system tends to have its own kind of unique function or role in the larger system, right? So, you probably wouldn't get the same kinds of resources from your grad school friends that you would get from your immediate family, right? So I want to start with Simmel because, he's the man. He's my favorite theorist, with the exception of maybe Durkheim. But sociologists have for a long time recognized the importance of clustering for determining the structure of a network, and this starts with Simmel. And he proposed this idea that in modern society, people's social circles are now organized in a set of sort of loosely connected social circles. In pre-modern society, they tended to be more overlapping. So, your kin were also the people you worked with, the people you socialized with, et cetera. Now it's like, all bets are off. You can interact with anyone. Wellman has done a lot of work on this. Very interesting work. But what happens is you have these loosely connected social circles, but then you create transitivity across clusters. Because a lot of humans like to do things like organizing activities and inviting different kinds of friends to those activities from different parts of your network. or you might introduce individuals from different clusters of your network to each other. So an important aspect of dynamics is how clusters and the ties between these clusters might form and dissolve over time. So not just how ties form and design, but also, or form and dissolve, but also how these connections between clusters might form and dissolve over time. Another theory that I love that I want to bring up is the theory of shared foci of activity. So Scott Feld developed this theory to explain how personal network clusters emerge, essentially, and how interconnections among them emerge, and also he relates this to homophily in social networks. And he argued that social ties tend to form around joint activities, and I use the term activities kind of loosely because really this means people or places or social roles, social groups, hobbies, things like that, and that these joint activities organize social life. So this is really important for dynamics because as people's foci change, so do their networks, right? So as they move to a new location, their networks tend to change, right? And so this graphic depicts the networks of a husband and a wife using multidimensional scaling. And this comes from a study of large personal networks by anthropologist Chris McCarty. And what he did is he used cluster analysis to, this is a great study if you don't know it, to identify subgroups of alters. And he found a lot of commonalities across different people's networks. So for example, all ego networks contained a cluster that was comprised of kin. And about half had another cluster containing in-laws. And then other sort of common clusters that he found in his data were friends of your partner or spouse, which Ben knows about because he did some research on impotence related to this idea. And then other sort of clusters that were focused around shared foci of activity, like old school friends or coworkers or church friends or whatever. So importantly, in addition to identifying these clusters, McCarty also observed a non-trivial amount of overlap between the clusters. And additionally, another important finding here is that most of the interconnections between the clusters that he found tended to be anchored, right? So they were anchored by these multiplex ties. Often they were family members or spouses that tended to be closer and better known to egos. So the point there is that alters who are embedded in multiple foci and who sort of serve this anchoring function in the networks are a lot less likely to drop out of the network, right? So we have to sort of keep this in mind as we're thinking about trying to predict dynamics. And then finally is the idea of functional specificity. And so we've done a little bit of research on this. It's the idea that people cultivate particular kinds of relationships and exchanges with different alters or different clusters of alters in their network. So this figure is from Bierman and Parigi's work on the important matters name generator using the GSS. It's called Cloning Headless Frogs and Other Important Matters, one of the best paper titles ever. And what they found using GSS data is that people tend to talk about particular topics with particular kinds of people, and they call this role topic dependency, right? So again, different parts of the network tend to have different functions, or in this case, even different topics that they tend to talk about. And Barry Wellman and others have sort of similarly argued that people tend to rely on various clusters or various network members for only one or a few specific functions, rather than counting on one person or one or the core network, for example, to fulfill all of their needs. And he talks about this in terms of the difference between networks being boutiques or general stores, right? And he argues that in fact networks more and more are becoming these boutiques, right, where we sort of get what we need from various different parts of our network. But what's interesting is that doesn't mean that there aren't certain alters or clusters of alters that are primary, right, and that they're more broadly supportive. Of course, we see that. That's indicative of the core network. But nonetheless, most networks tend to contain more specialized ties that tend to be useful in a more limited, albeit still influential way. And this, of course, has really important implications for network dynamics over the life course, particularly in older adults, as we heard a lot about today, because as people age, they tend to participate in fewer social roles and activities on average, which may cause networks to shrink and look more like Zimmel's pre-modern networks. And so, what we're doing in my sort of newish R01 is understanding the implications of this for cognitive decline. Okay, principle 4. Personal networks exhibit hierarchical structure. So there are these hierarchical circles of acquaintanceship that tend to be anchored by a cohesive core and then surrounded by a weaker, more transitory or loosely connected set of peripheral alters. Some of the subsystems' functions are heavily dependent on other subsystems, while others tend to be relatively independent. So you end up with sort of hubs that have lots of connections to other parts of the network. And so this ends up meaning that some parts of the network or some subsystems perform relatively more critical or central functions than others do. So the first thing I'll mention here is the very well-researched core periphery structure of networks, right? So personal networks tend to be organized hierarchically into this type of core periphery structure. So we have this small, densely knit core, and then that tends to be surrounded by this weaker, more loosely connected set of alters. And this structure is really important for studying social network dynamics because the core tends to remain relatively stable over time, while the periphery is characterized by a very large amount of instability and membership turnover, particularly with regard to activation. So that has some methodological implications for sort of how much of the network we can see, right, or how much we're trying to shine a light on in understanding dynamic processes. So the periphery tends to be more adaptable, more transitory, and potentially more functionally specific. And this structure is useful because it facilitates caducean sort of safety and effectiveness, right? So you get the safety from the core and you get the effectiveness from the periphery or the set of weak ties, which might provide access to non-redundant resources. And again, these are caduceans to fundamental drives motivating the formation and maintenance of personal network ties. Another sort of line of research that I want to mention is Dunbar's number. So Dunbar conceptualized personal networks as a series of circles of acquaintanceship, which are sort of depicted here, or circles of intimacy. And the idea here is that each ascending layer, as you get bigger, contains more people with whom relationships are less intimate or accessible, but also less costly to maintain. So researchers in his lab and others have argued that each layer serves a distinct evolutionary function. It has its own sort of trade-offs between costs, which would be the demands and the resources that are involved in making and maintaining these ties, and that is a trade-off with the benefits, right? So the support or other sort of social or material resources that you can obtain from your network. So ideally, you want sort of a mix of these different kinds of ties. And then finally, I want to talk about the consequences of the hierarchical structure, which is, the causes of the hierarchical structure, because this is really driven by clustering patterns and by sort of different degrees of relational embedding. And so this is a network graphic from Leskovic, I really don't know how to pronounce that, and Macaulay, and they did a study of personal social network structure on social networking sites. And what they found is that there are some peripheral clusters that are evident. So about 25% of clusters have no overlap with other clusters. About 50% have some overlap with other clusters. And then 25% are contained completely in another cluster. So I really like these studies that are trying to find commonalities in network structure across different studies and different populations. So their contribution is that although there's variation across network clusters in sort of the degree of relational embedding, or the extent to which ties or clusters emerge out of different foci of activity, these are interconnected with each other. And they're sort of anchored by these relationally embedded ties, which tend to be more durable, more intimate, and more multiplex. Okay. Principle 5, this is the last one in case you aren't keeping track and your stomach is growling. So we've talked a lot about this, right? The structure of personal networks is stable while network membership is more dynamic. Shira's presentation using the UC Nets data I thought yesterday was just really remarkable and provided super clear evidence of this, even in sort of relatively large-ish networks for personal network studies. So I thought that was really great to see. But fluid network membership is characteristic, in particular, of the kinds of society that we live in today, right? So we're more mobile, we're more heterogeneous, we live in these urban societies where there are lots of opportunities for interacting across social circles with lots of different kinds of people. There's less constraint, and Wellman has done a lot of research on this with regard to technology use. Okay. So one of the first points I want to make about this that are hopefully a little bit different than the things that we've heard about in this symposium, right? So I'm going to sort of dig into not just that this pattern exists, but sort of some of the more interesting things I think about it. And one is that the evolution of personal network dynamics tends to be really bursty, right? It's nonlinear, and it also can be cumulative, right? So what your network looked like 5 years ago can affect what it looks like today. And sometimes it's random, right, the way that networks change. And this makes it really difficult. It's a huge challenge for those of us who study this to predict which alters or clusters of alters are going to be elicited in any given snapshot of the network, right? Not to mention, you know, the cognitive heuristics and everything else that sort of mess those things up. And so there have been some sort of different types of research looking at what causes these bursty dynamics or these periods of sort of rapid underlying membership turnover. So one of the first books that I read in graduate school was Everything in Its Path by Kai Erikson. It is absolutely a fascinating read. If you haven't read it, you totally should. It's brilliant. And in this book, he talks about the sort of devastating both personal and community effects of the Buffalo Creek flood that happened in West Virginia in sometime in the 1970s. And so a dam broke, and you know, all this like coal sludge. It was, of course, like, you know, the evil coal companies, King Coal. All this sludge came down and just completely decimated multiple towns along Buffalo Creek. And so these communities were suddenly uprooted and dispersed, right, to FEMA trailers, and they were not kept within their own communities. And so this book is just a really interesting example of how a massive network disruption like this has adverse effects on individuals and communities above and beyond sort of the primary disruption, or in this case, the natural disaster, right? And so there's been other research kind of like this on exogenous shocks to the lives of individuals that can cause sort of similar consequences for networks. So Bernice and I have studied serious illness. People have studied things like widowhood, divorce. You know, so there's quite a bit of research on this that I think is really interesting. But even beyond these like major shocks, even normative life course transitions like that we consider to be relatively positive can also cause, you know, massive changes to dynamics. So things like going to college or entering the workforce, getting married, having kids, definitely having kids for sure, retiring, right? All these things are associated with substantial turnover in the individuals that make up the network. But nonetheless, like the network structure tends to remain pretty much the same. It kind of bounces back from these sort of shocks. So along these lines, I'm going to show a figure from a study by Ben Cornwell and colleagues. And in this paper, their talk, which is a brand new paper, really interesting, they're talking about homeostasis and replacement in networks. And so this shows different patterns of turnover in the confidant networks of in-chat respondents between waves 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, which occurred about 5 years apart. I think all of you know these data, so I won't belabor it. But you can see that the gray bars here represent stable network size and basically equal turnover, equal churn underlying the network. And then the reds are people who experienced different degrees of losses, and the greens are different degrees of gains. But the really interesting thing here is that these frequencies form a normal distribution, with the majority of respondents achieving a kind of homeostasis in network size, right? But interestingly, even those who had little or no change in the overall size had a fair amount of membership turnover underlying the stability in network size over time. And so these findings are indicative of a pattern of structural similarity with replacement, right? So lost or latent ties are substituted by new or formerly inactive ties. So the network sort of wants to move towards homeostasis. So we have these periods of elevated turnover or dynamics at the level of ties, but the structure of the whole tends to rebalance and recover, trending towards stability, essentially, at the structural level. And then lastly, with this principle, I want to talk about social signatures, which is sort of a new area of research that I find really interesting. And it's mostly coming out of communications, suggesting that individuals have what they call persistent social signatures, or habitual patterns of interaction within members or with members of their personal networks. And that these are part of what contributes to personal network structure that is stable and also hierarchical. So there's a study by Saramaki et al. Using longitudinal call and text data. So it's one of these like huge big data studies that we would only dream about having samples of these sizes. But what he finds, or they find, is that people vary in their allocation of time and effort to different alters in their network, regardless of who those alters are. So, they make these really cool network graphics that show sort of communication patterns. And even though the actual individual that is in that sort of place, whatever that place is, might change over time, their overall sort of social signature, the ways and the amount that they tend to interact with their alters is remarkably stable. So anytime they increase their interaction with one alter, that results in the downgrading of another alter, which is super interesting, right? And so they're arguing that these social signatures may be driven by human cognitive limitations, which make it not really feasible to maintain really intimate and really frequent contact with more than some small subset of the overall network, right? So you can't be BFFs with everybody in your network at the same time. So the extent to which we're sort of intensely interacting with a given set of people changes, but that number of people and the intensity of that interaction doesn't change, right? That's our social signature. And then at the same time, and at this point sort of circling back to where we started, we tend to see, again, repeated evidence of what I might call social heuristics, like kinship, transitivity, and homophily, that contribute to the stability of personal network structure. And the cool thing is that we see these same social heuristics across many social non-human species, right? So this suggests that there's something about this structure, these properties, that are adaptive. So for example, there's a lot of research suggesting transitivity in the relationships of yellow-bellied marmots, which are these little guys up at the top who kiss. They're one of the only other species that kiss, which I think is really adorable. There's research suggesting that there's reciprocity in horses. There is evidence of a very strong core periphery structure in the networks of rhesus macaques, which are the monkeys at the bottom here, who have social structures that very much resemble humans. And there's kin selection in ground squirrels, right? So we can look across lots of different types of species and find some of these same patterns repeated over and over again. And what I think makes a lot of sense is that these properties are adaptive because the stable structural properties of the system reduce the likelihood that the system is going to fail if one specific person or cluster sort of drops out of the network, right? So again, the network moves towards homeostasis. Okay, so quick synthesis, and then I'll move on to implications. So personal networks provide sort of an ideal balance between security and adaptability, right? these properties that I've talked about today suggest that personal network dynamics exhibit properties that are highly consistent with the principles of complex systems. So in brief, humans tend to survive and thrive through social interactions and connectedness, and that results in these bottom-up structures that sort of emerge out of dynamic noise, right, or action sets or tie activation. And these personal networks are emergent, and they're dynamic, and they're adaptive, and they allow people to cope with challenging and uncertain environments that might threaten their well-being, right? So they're flexibly responsive as to things that are happening in the environment. And then at the same time, we have these microstructures and social heuristics that help us to maintain order and that we see across different species. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the methodological implications of this, and then about some areas of research, some of which are sort of eerily similar to directions that people in this symposium are already going in, but directions for research that I think would be really interesting and fruitful. So in terms of methodological implications, for name generators and interpreters specifically, we really need name generators that elicit the periphery and more sporadic ties. We need much more research like what Chris McCarty does, where he aims for an elicitation of 40 or more alters. And this is so important because we really are very limited in what can be learned when we only look at, the core 5 or 6 alters. And this characterizes almost all of my own research as well, right? So I'm sort of turning the lens on me as well. Another thing is that we need more precise methods, or need to more consistently use precise methods for identifying which particular alters are coming and going. And I think that Bernice Pescasolido and Ed Lauman started doing this early on, Claude Fisher. More recently, the stuff coming out of their groups is really spot on. And in fact, I contacted Claude after an ASA presentation and Shira and said, I have to adopt some of these methods in my new study. So I'm really sort of in awe of the UC Next study, how it's treating this sort of attention to comings and goings. So just kudos to that group who I think is doing this correctly. And then also we need more qualitative interpreters to understand why alters are coming and going, right? So not only to be able to distinguish real change from activation and deactivation in the methodological sense, but also to be able to formulate theories about why we're seeing dynamics in social networks. And of course, Claire is doing some of this research. I was really interested to hear about this yesterday. And then if you haven't seen it, Claude and Shira also with their UCNet study have a piece that just came out in the 2020 volume of Social Networks that is exactly on this topic. And I think we need more like this. We need more replication to understand qualitatively why networks are changing. For study design, we need more research on network dynamics in general populations. A lot of the research on network change tends to be focused on sort of small slices of the life course, or people that are experiencing similar sets of problems or similar experiences. And this is, I think, probably practical in that that's how you get funding for this kind of research, or at least enough funding to do cool things. But also, I think, people want to reduce a lot of the noise, right? So that they can sort of hone in on sort of people who might be experiencing a similar set of events or conditions. But we also need to know what's happening in the general population so that we can understand how the broader social structure is influencing these network dynamics across different kinds of populations. We need longitudinal personal network data over the life course so that we can understand how networks early in life affect networks later. And then I really am interested in these small n as in small big N, so small number of egos but large number of observations collected close together in time, right? So these studies using ecological momentary assessment or similar, where you're getting these snapshots of the network, once a week or even every day for a small number of egos, but then you end up with this massive amount of data on observations over time. And that's really what we need, because a lot of the dynamic network data that we have now, there's 5 years between waves, or a year maybe at best, or 6 months at best, but there's just so much that happens between those waves that's really hard to come up with solid evidence for anything like these general properties about how and when and why networks change. In terms of thinking about future research, I would love to see more research on social signatures or characteristics of networks in homeostasis, right? So what kinds of individual or social structural conditions affect variations in people's social signatures, or the things that sort of move us towards homeostasis. And then what are the outcomes for different types of populations, or sorry, what are the outcomes of having a different kind of social signature for individuals? And then also, how do these social signatures affect dynamic processes like tie activation? So, for example, well, it wasn't that long ago, but a while ago, Val Hurlburt and some colleagues found that individuals' experiences in the core networks, and she was studying tie activation in a hurricane, she found that individuals' experiences in their core networks produce these sort of frames or supportive cultures that condition people's responses in crisis situations. So when we're looking at what happens, during a hurricane or a serious illness, or during widowhood, those sort of tie activation processes are conditioned by, sort of the kinds of support and the amounts of support that people are receiving in the everyday, right? So understanding how the normal affects the abnormal, times of abnormality or crisis. I would love for us to better understand the cumulative nature of network stability and dynamics. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about methods, but how do network properties early in life affect later life networks? So, if you study the life course at all, you know that you almost never start a new phase of your life with a clean slate. You bring all your junk from past parts of your life into your current life. And so I think exploring Claire's calendar method or similar, we could use longitudinal data to understand important events and turning points that affect network dynamics across the life course. And selfishly, for those of us who are studying older adults, how can we accurately approximate networks retrospectively over the life course, right? And I think this calendar method or something like it is promising, right? But how do we understand where networks have been, for the 50, 60, 70 years before we actually started observing these older adults? And then along the same lines, I think we need more of what Ben is doing with regard to sequence analysis. So how does the timing and the ordering of events affect network analysis, or network dynamics, sorry. And then lastly, we need to identify dynamic interdependencies between different components of the network. So not just looking at ties between alters, but also ties between different parts of the network. So how does change in one subnetwork or one sort of cluster or clique affect change in another? Questions like, where in the network do activated ties or action sets come from, and why? And this, I think, really requires a multi-level sort of network of networks approach, right, which is complicated and sort of moves us into sociocentric territory. But I think that understanding the whole system is going to require this sort of bird's eye view of the different parts of the system. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you.